Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good, and apparently we are just in Unearthed Arcana season. We're kind of getting back to back to back Unearthed Arcanas, which is making it basically all of my content at this point. I think we're getting towards the holidays, so maybe we'll see some stepping back as some other products come out. Like, I know we're expecting the delayed release of the new Eberron pretty soon here in November, I believe it was, as well as Christmas is coming around. Maybe there'll be some releases coming out there that we can look at as well, but right now it's just back to back Unearthed Arcana. Definitely giving me sort of PTSD from Magic the Gathering and the sort of endless hype season that they have with that game. But what they released recently was the revised Psion class, which is pretty exciting. Again, this is the first new class that they've released since the Artificer. Of course, it hasn't been officially released yet, but we've seen one original Unearthed Arcana, and now we see a revision to it. So in this video, we're just going to be covering the base class, and that includes the base class, the spells that are included in this Unearthed Arcana, as well as the Psionic Disciplines, if you recall, if you looked at the original one. We'll take a look at the subclasses in my next video, but also what is important to note here is also what is not in this Unearthed Arcana, and that includes one of the subclasses, which is the Psi Warper, as well as the Wild Talents, which were like sort of origin feats for Psions, as well as some general feats that were sort of based on those origin type feats, those Wild Talents. So those things are no longer in the revised version. I don't know if there's a particular reason for that, if they just thought they were fine. There are some hints as to what is happening in this revision that we'll take a look at, and we'll talk about that when we get there. One other thing to note before we get started, normally I go through like every feature, whether or not there are changes, and I'll just say that there aren't changes. But since this is a lot of content to go through, and to try to make these videos just a little bit shorter, because I know I'm a bit of a yapper, like I'm doing right now, I'm only going to show where there were changes. So if there's a feature that seems to be missing that you remember was in the original one, chances are it wasn't changed, or if it was changed and I didn't catch it, definitely let me know down in the comments. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. As always, again, starting with the summary. There aren't really any significant functional or notable changes to the summary. They just changed the word their minds to the word thought. You know, they wield magic and extraordinary powers through the power of thought rather than their mind. I don't know if they just thought that they were saying the word minds too many times. It was the power of their minds, and then they developed their minds as a font of power. So maybe they just thought that they were saying minds too much. Who knows? Not really important. Let's get into the actual features of the class, starting at level 1 with spellcasting. There's one buff here where we can say we did it, maybe. In the original Unearthed Arcana on the left side, you can see that they got their extra cantrips at level 10 and 14. This was one of my main critiques of the original Unearthed Arcana. This was a long time for a full caster to wait for their second cantrip. This has been normalized to basically represent every other full caster where they get their extra cantrips at 4 and 10. This definitely feels a lot better. I think every caster, especially ones that rely on cantrips, need an extra one early on. I don't mind so much when that last one comes online, but normalizing it to just match every other full caster is perfectly fine to me. So happy to see that one here. Moving on to their other level 1 feature, we have Psionic Power. And while there's technically no changes to Psionic Power, there are like formatting changes in the Psion table. Of course, Psionic Power is managed by their Psionic Energy dice, and the Psionic class table determines how many dice you get as well as the size of that dice. So we can see that on the left side, these were originally 2 different columns, but on the right side is the revised version where they combine it into one column and it's 4d6 instead of your energy die is a d6 and you have 4 of them. So they just smashed it together, but it looks impressive on the table when you see 12d12 and you're like, oh my god, what does that mean? But it is really just the pool of dice that you have and the size that they are. You're not necessarily spending them all at once, and currently there's no way to do that. As we move on to the second part of Psionic Power, the actual features that you get at level 1 from Psionic Power, we see changes to Telekinetic Propel as well as Telepathic Connection. Telekinetic Propel has been enhanced to basically have a free version of it. This free version does not expend any Psionic Energy die. This is basically the telekinetic push-pull of the telekinetic feet, where you can target a creature within 30 feet and then you can pull them or push them 5 feet directly toward or away from you. So you can do this for free. Originally in the Unearthed Arcana, you had to spend a Psionic Energy die to even do this, but now you get that for free. If you want to use a Psionic Energy die, you can instead spend that Psionic Energy die to increase the distance that you can move that creature. This was also one of my main suggestions towards this one, is that, I feel like if I were a Psion, because one, I love the telekinetic feat. If you're relatively new to my videos and you haven't heard me say that, it's one of my favorite feats for casters in the game, but I was feeling that as a Psion, I would still feel obligated to take the telekinetic feat to just get that free push-pull for that 5 feet, because that's so useful in so many situations. But now that it's actually baked into the feature, I don't really feel that way anymore. So I'm really excited to see that change here. Telepathic connection. This has had a base range increase of 30 feet from 5 feet. So you have a base telepathy range of 30 feet. 5 feet was a really awkward distance. I guess technically they maybe wanted to limit it only to your allies that you might be near most of the time. But even in those situations, that can create some really awkward looking situations. So 30 feet is much better. Definitely makes those situations much less likely to happen. Additionally, the active version of this, the bonus action to activate the telepathic connection to expand the range of your telepathic connection, the duration of it has been increased to a flat 1 hour. This is up from 1 minute per Psion level. So pretty big change there, as well as you now get that activation once for free per long rest, which means that you don't need to spend the Psionic Energy die to expand your telepathic range. Every subsequent time you do need to spend it, but that first time you do not. I still feel like the telepathic connection is maybe the weakest feature here. At higher levels, it's basically just going to be replaced by Rary's telepathic bond, at least when it comes to like your party members and including them in the particular spell effect. And then for non-party members, you can have a cantrip like message. I mean, having this feature basically means I maybe don't need to take message for that reason. But assuming that there are better things that I want to spend my Psionic Energy die on, I couldn't see myself very frequently at least using the activated version of this telepathic connection. That isn't to say that it's bad. This is just your level 1 feature. I just think that there are plenty of other options that allow you to do this. Of course, there is the opportunity cost of taking those spells as opposed to having this feature instead. So there are trade-offs here and there. But that is Psionic power. Let's go and move on to where we see our next change here at level 2 in Psionic Disciplines. So Psionic Disciplines were slightly streamlined, I guess you could call it, where in the original Unearth Arcana, you would get 2 additional disciplines at level 10 and then 2 additional disciplines at level 17. This has been changed to keep the same total number of Psionic Disciplines. You still get 2 at level 2 when you get this feature, but now you get 1 at level 5, 1 at level 10, 1 at level 13, and 1 at level 17. So you still get 6 total, but now you get those additional ones more frequently throughout your levels. Maybe it doesn't feel like you're having such a huge spike at level 10 and another spike at level 17. It's much more streamlined, which is nice because, getting that extra Psionic Discipline early on at level 5, because, some low-level adventures don't even go to level 10, so you might not even see that as a Psion. Overall, I think these are very good changes for this feature. So that then brings us to the next change, and this is Psionic Modes at level 2. And we can see that this one has actually been completely removed in the new Unearth Arcana. So Psionic Modes, you had like an attack mode and a defense mode. I know in the original Unearth Arcana, I thought this was just one very tackily named, like it's just very kind of corny. It didn't really strike me as having to do anything with psionics necessarily. So for that reason, I just kind of feel like they were tacked onto the class, had a really corny name. I mean, the mechanics are fine, I suppose, but we can see that they've been removed. And according to the design notes, aspects of the design can be seen in other features like Psionic Disciplines. So maybe one or more of these modes we'll see baked into the Psionic Disciplines later on. But as far as being in the base class, they have been removed, and I'm kind of okay with that personally. And baking one or more of these features into the disciplines, I think is a safe way of walking it back without completely removing it. That then brings us to our next change here at level 3. Actually, we wouldn't expect changes in the Psionic subclass, the subclass feature for a class, but one thing to note here is not only is the Psi Warper not in this Unearthed Arcana, but it is removed from the subclass options in this Unearthed Arcana, like in the actual text of the subclasses that would be available to you, which to me would suggest that they just toss that one in the bin, at least for now, at least. It doesn't mean that we won't see a Psi Warper in the future, but it just means that maybe they feel it needs more work than they can put into it before the Psion would be released. This tells me that we would expect the Metamorph, Psychonetic, and the Telepath to be released with the Psion. Maybe we'll see a Psi Warper in the future. This is purely speculation. There are no design notes about removing the Psi Warper from this subclass revision, but that's what I would expect based on the fact that they just removed it purely from the text here. That then brings us to level 5, where we see our next change. So this is Psionic Restoration. Originally, when you finished a short rest, you could regain Psionic Energy die, but it was equal to half your number of dice rounded down. And this was only once per long rest. My initial opinion of this was that I wasn't sure if this would be enough recovery for the Psion. When you have a class that's based around consuming and using a secondary resource like your bards and even subclasses like your battle masters, things like that, usually you get these back pretty frequently. One thing to note is that the Psion does have a larger pool of dice. They have more dice to use as compared to the bard, for example, with inspiration, or at least it gets larger as they level up. But they have buffed that to not only be faster in the sense that you can do it after 1 minute of meditation, similar to the monks one for their focus points. I don't know if they still technically have to meditate, but I know that was the original one in 2014 that they had to meditate to get their key points back. Not only can you do it in just a minute as opposed to a whole long rest, which is traditionally an hour, but now you get all of your expended energy dice back rather than just half of them. It is still once per long rest, but in terms of just overall resource efficiency, this is a a very welcome change. That then brings us to level 7, where we have Psionic Surge. So we can see that there's been one sort of small paragraph here completely removed from this one. This small paragraph dealt with the psionic modes. Of course, psionic modes don't exist anymore. We saw that that feature was removed at level 2. However, this leaves us with only the second half of the feature, which arguably, in my opinion, was the least useful half of the feature. I think the regaining psionic modes, as critical as I was of psionic modes, was the best use of this feature, whereas being able to treat any roll of your psionic energy dice that is a 1, 2, or 3 as a 4 by expending one of your hit dice, I just generally think that's rarely going to be worth the trade-off. You know, we will see in the future with Psionic Disciplines where that might be useful, but I just think rarely will there be a great use of this. One thing that I was thinking of that maybe could take this a step further, if they wanted to buff this particular feature, is to have a second paragraph where it says you can also expend one of your psionic energy dice to treat a roll of a 1, 2, or 3 as a 4 on a d20 test. So on your attack roll, saving throws, or ability checks. This would at least cover those instances where you would have a check that you should normally succeed because they have a relatively high bonus to it, but you just rolled low on it, where you want to make sure that you make that attack or skill check or d20 test, whatever it is, that you can kind of bump that up just a few points, maybe get you over that threshold. You know, that isn't a huge boost in most situations, especially as you get higher in levels and checks get harder and harder, but at least it would make it so that it makes it very difficult to fail checks that you should be good at. After level 7, we're going to skip all the way to level 18. Remember that the Psion is getting their Psionic Disciplines throughout additional levels as well, so there are features technically between 7 and 18, but there are no new features between 7 and 18, and at 18, we see a brand new feature in this Unearthed Arcana. There was nothing previously at level 18, so we see Psionic Reserves. It says when you roll initiative, you regain expended uses of psionic energy die until you have 4 if you have fewer than that. This kind of efficiency feature is not uncommon in 2024, but as far as copycat features from other classes, this is an example of that I'm not particularly mad at. I think every class that has a secondary resource that they depend on, especially with the way that 2024 design is going, every class kind of needs that in order to feel like they're not really behind all these other classes that are really efficient with their resources. So I think as a higher level Psion, at least between this and the Psionic Restoration at level 5, probably never really going to worry much about their energy dice pools. That then brings us to the capstone at level 20. We have Enkindled Life Force. This has had some minor changes. First things first, you can now expend 1 or 2 of your hit point dice when you activate this effect rather than specifically 2, and you now roll that many psionic energy die equal to the number of hit dice that you expended, either the 1 or the 2. Additionally, there's some clarifying text at the bottom where it says this roll does not expend psionic energy die. That was technically always the case in the Unearthed Arcana designer notes. They did say that this is a clarification. So this isn't really a buff per se, but it is just clarifying that you're not supposed to expend hit die and then also expend your psionic energy die at the same time. But if you thought that was the case, that it was kind of double dipping in resources, then this would be technically a huge buff for you. But technically, this is just a clarification, not necessarily a buff. But I do think that the change of being able to choose 1 or 2 hit dice does mean a lot, especially when it comes to kind of being more flexible, especially with your Psionic Disciplines and using this feature in that way. Speaking of Psionic Disciplines, now that we've reached the capstone of this class, let's get into the changes in the disciplines. Remember, if there's a discipline missing, that means there are no changes in that discipline. I don't think there are many, if at all. We are just covering features that have changes in them, so we're starting with Biofeedback. Biofeedback lets you gain temporary hit points by expending psionic energy dice when you cast a necromancy or transmutation spell. This has been buffed from, instead of expending 1 psionic energy die when you activate this effect, you can activate a number of psionic energy die equal to your intelligence modifier. So you can go from basically 1 to up to 5 once you've maxed your intelligence, possibly more if you get intelligence beyond 20. And in my previous video, we looked at how good of a use of Psionic Surge and Enkindled Life Force that this might be in game, and where I think this was a bad use of Psionic Surge previously because you're only expending 1 psionic energy die and the temporary hit point gain from that would not offset the lack of recovery later. Now that you can roll a bunch of psionic energy die if you see a lot of low rolls and you can decide to use it after the roll, you can kind of do the math now to see if you would break even on expending the 1 hit die to gain a few more temporary hit points, if that at least breaks even, or maybe even better if you roll really poorly, offer more temporary hit point gain than you would get from a single hit die during a short rest. And if it's a good use of Psionic Surge, chances are it's a great use of Enkindled Life Force, since that is just additive onto this. So you'd be rolling at level 20 2 additional d12s or up to 2 additional d12s compared to the d6s that you would normally be using as your hit die. So it's much more likely that the bonus temporary hit points is going to be more than what you'd get from recovery from your hit dice. The change to be able to use a number of psionic energy die equal to your intelligence modifier is also very good if you consider spells like Armor of Agathis, if you can get that on your Psion, because this is just another way of getting a bursty amount of temporary hit points in the way that spells like Armor of Agathis now work. As long as you have any temporary hit points, you can continue that effect. The next Psionic Discipline is called Bolstering Precognition. precognition. In the original Unearth Arcana, this was called swift precognition, but the effect has changed, the name has changed. So originally this let you essentially quicken a spell, but that functionality has basically just been removed. Instead, you now just spend 1 psionic energy die whenever you cast an abjuration or divination school spell. You roll the die, you choose a creature within 60 feet, including yourself possibly, and then until the end of your next turn, that creature gains a bonus to their next d20 test that it makes equal to the number rolled. So whether that is going to be a saving throw that an enemy casts against them, their next attack roll, or an ability check if they're trying to do something in the middle of combat, maybe. It's possible that you could even do this out of combat as well. We can see examples of that. I would consider this a bad use of Psionic Surge because we have no idea what that person is going to roll on their dice when we use this. So maybe if someone is like in a hold person and they're making saving throws at disadvantage, maybe you would give them a Psionic Surge in that situation just to give them a little bit of help. That's pretty much the only kind of circumstance that I'd be using Psionic Surge for bolstering precognition. However, I would say that this is probably a good to great use of Enkindled Life Force simply because you're adding so much more to that roll than just like a 1, 2, or 3. Adding an average of 13 to a roll is basically possibly all but guaranteeing a future save, or acting like the guided strike from the cleric where you get like the +10 to hit on your next attack. Or if you just have a really important skill check that you're trying to do, you can also do that as well. I mean, you can trigger this out of combat with like the Blade Ward cantrip, for example. So if you're out of combat, you can still use this. And that is something to note about these disciplines that do trigger off spells, is that they do not specify a spell of level 1 or higher. For example, the biofeedback triggered off necromancy and transmutation. There are no necromancy cantrips for the Psion, but they do have mending, message, and prestidigitation for transmutation. So you could trigger biofeedback out of combat off of those spells. Moving on to the next discipline, we have Destructive Thoughts. This one was changed slightly to where originally you had to target a creature who succeeded on a saving throw against a spell, whereas now it's a creature that is just making a saving throw against a spell. Additionally, you can now expend a number of psionic energy die equal to your intelligence modifier, whereas previously you can only expend 1. When you do this, you're dealing psychic damage to the creature making that saving throw that you're targeting. And not only that, but they take that damage regardless of whether they pass or fail the saving throw of that spell. This is pretty useful on like save or suck spells, where if they make the saving throw that it does nothing, this is basically treating it like taking half damage almost. You can consider it kind of like that, where that spell is always going to be doing something because you're always dealing a bit of psychic damage. Or for spells that even do half damage on a save, you're just adding more damage onto that for that specific creature at least. Ideally, that extra damage is also securing a kill, hopefully. And on that note, I would probably say that this may be a bad to maybe okay use of Psionic Surge, leaning towards bad for sure, just because you're adding such little bits of damage. And unless you have some sort of visual indicator of how close to death that creature is, like I know in like Roll20, for example, you sometimes have the color circles if your DM has put those in, that if it's like a deep red, you know that they're almost dead. And so those extra points of damage could matter. But I would imagine in most cases, we probably don't know how many hit points a creature has left. So I'd probably not be using Psionic Surge ever on these kinds of rolls. However, for Enkindled Life Force, I would say okay to good use of it. Again, you're just adding so much more damage. An extra 13 damage could make the difference. Maybe that's not so much at level 20, but adding 13 average extra damage to all the other damage that you're using, it could possibly just secure that kill. When it comes to triggering this Destructive Thoughts discipline with Conjuration or Evocation School spells, fortunately there are no Psion cantrips that really work with this discipline, because even though they do have cantrips of these schools, they do not force a creature to make a saving throw. That brings us to the next discipline of Devilish Tongue. This one has been altered just a little bit, where it says if this causes you to succeed the ability check, the die is expended. So normally this lets you just add a psionic energy die bonus to an influence action, and previously it was expended no matter what, but now it's only expended if you succeed on that check. This seems like a relatively small change, but it's actually pretty huge because that makes this basically all reward and no risk. I would argue that this is maybe a bad use of Psionic Surge unless you're confident that the difference that you're making with Psionic Surge is the difference between pass and fail, and ideally that check should have meaning. That doesn't mean that we should only use our features when it means something. You know, sometimes it's fun to just have fun with it and kind of do it for the memes or whatever. But as far as Enkindled Life Force, again, being able to add such a higher bonus to your influence actions, especially since influence actions of the new actions you can take, I think generally might have the higher stakes. I could see using, Enkindled Life Force to make sure that I make a persuasion check or a deception check or something at the right time. The next one we're looking at here is Ego Whip, and we're going to move past this one pretty quick. This one has been removed from the Unearth Arcana. However, the design notes did mention that this has been moved to it being a spell, so we'll take a look at that a little bit later. The next one is Expanded Awareness. This is much like the influence action one, where this is affecting the search action. Much like that one, it no longer expends the die if you still fail the check. This is a bad use of Psionic Surge because, again, search actions are unlikely to be high stakes, and if you don't know whether that check is going to be pass-fail, then it's probably not worth using. Even probably being just a bad use of Enkindled Life Force because you're expending recovery to possibly make a check that, again, doesn't really have any stakes. Not saying that that would never happen, just very unlikely. Moving on to Id Insinuation. This one triggers whenever you cast a Psion spell that is of the Enchantment or Illusion school. Originally you had to spend 2 Psionic Energy die to roll 1, but now you're just expending 1 to roll 1. And what this did was penalize the saving throw of a creature making a saving throw against your Enchantment or Illusion spell. Whereas in the original Unearth Arcana, they had the full penalty of the die roll of the Psionic Energy die to that saving throw. This has been sort of nerfed essentially to half that number rounded up. So you're expending half the dice and you're getting half the results. So it's just a bit of tuning, I think. Even though this is technically nerfed, I think it makes sense. Being able to penalize a saving throw is a very big deal. And being able to almost guarantee a failed save if you roll well may be a little too much power to put in the hands of players. Overall, I'd say this is now just a bad use of Psionic Surge because this is now only relevant if you roll a 1 or a 2. And even then, it's only increasing the penalty by a possible of 1. It doesn't matter if it's a 3 or a 4. Again, unless you're positive that that extra 1 is going to be the difference between a pass and a fail, then I probably would never use Psionic Surge on this feature. However, probably a good use of Enkindled Life Force, adding 2d12 to the original 1d12, even if you're only having the total, brings the average penalty from a 3 of 1d12 to a total of 9 with 3d12, which can be enough to make a difference. Maybe not at level 20 because, saving throw bonuses of creatures at those CRs and higher are definitely very inflated. But if they don't have good bonuses to that particular save, then penalizing them by an average of 9 can possibly still guarantee a fail. That brings us then to the next discipline. This one is called Observant Mind. This was originally called Tactical Mind in the original Unearth Arcana. Much like the Influence and Search action disciplines, this one is centered around the Study action. Again, much like those ones, it now doesn't expend the die if you fail the check. And then much like the one for the Search action, again, I would consider it a bad use of Psionic Surge and a bad use of Enkindled Life Force for exactly the same reasons. Simply because these rolls typically don't have stakes that would justify expending your hit dice to use them. Again, not to say that you shouldn't do it for fun or whatever you want to do, but in terms of just making a meaningful difference, that brings us to Psionic Backlash. This one now only rolls 1 Psionic Energy die, and it now has an additional effect of reducing the damage you take from an attack equal to 2 times the number rolled on the die plus your intelligence modifier. So even though you're only rolling half the dice, you are doubling the total on those dice. So it's kind of a wash, more or less. You can still force that creature to make a wisdom saving throw, and when they fail that save, they take psychic damage equal to the amount of damage that you reduced with this effect. If you expend 1 Psionic Energy die, you double the amount, add your intelligence modifier, and reduce damage equal to that amount. You can make them make a wisdom saving throw, and then they take damage equal to the amount that you reduced. I would say this is probably an okay use of Psionic Surge, and this is only because it has a multiplier on it. So if you roll a 1 and you make it a 4, that's a difference of 3, so that's actually 6 that's being added onto this. This is probably the only situation where using Psionic Surge on a discipline where you're rolling only 1 Psionic Energy die is possibly actually useful because of that multiplier, and because you also have the knock-on effect of that multiplier also then affecting the creature by dealing extra damage to them as well. So it's kind of like double dipping almost. Not exactly, but you kind of get what I mean, where it's affecting 2 different things that are happening within this discipline. And if it's an okay use of Psionic Surge, that means it's definitely a great use of Enkindled Life Force. You're basically reducing the damage by an extra 26 damage on average. This not only makes a big difference on surviving, but also making concentration checks from heavy damage be more achievable. If you take 50 damage, that's a concentration check of 25, which is very difficult. But if you reduce that to 24, it's going to be even less technically because you're still rolling the 1d12. That's a much easier check to make, and you just reduced a bunch of damage as well. So overall, I think this is a great one to have. I could see this being probably one of the more popular disciplines. That brings us to the final discipline in the Unearth Arcana, and this one is called Sharpened Mind. This one is a brand new discipline, or kind of brand new. It says at the start of your turn, you can expend 1 Psionic Energy die to hone your destructive psionics, roll the die, and record the number rolled. You gain the following benefits for 1 minute or until you have the incapacitated condition. First, you have bypassing psionics, damage from your weapon attacks, psion spells, and psion features, ignore resistance to psychic damage. Secondly, you have attack mode. Again, remember the psionic modes from before. This has now been baked into this new discipline. It says once per turn, when you deal psychic damage to 1 or more creatures, you can replace the number rolled on one of the damage dice with the number recorded when you activated this Psionic Discipline. When you use Sharpened Mind, you can also use a different Psionic Discipline this turn. So this is actually one of 2 disciplines that you can use more than one on a turn. The other one in this Unearth Arcana didn't have any changes, so you're not seeing it here, but there is another one that has that effect. This is a pretty interesting feature. I mean, I don't think it gets too good until you get higher levels and you're rolling larger dice, but I would say this is maybe an okay to good use of Psionic Surge, and this is only because the damage is repeatable at least once per turn during the duration. Ideally, you would not only be causing psychic damage on your turn, but possibly having a lingering effect on other people's turn. If I'm only dealing psychic damage on my turn, since it is only once per turn, I'm maybe not quite activating this. Although if I'm running into psychic resistance, of course I'm going to use this regardless. But when it comes to Enkindled Life Force, I think that this would be a great use of Enkindled Life Force, again, because that damage is repeatable, and the more turns that you're able to deal psychic damage, the more you're able to just add that damage onto that effect. And I think one thing to note here as well, it says when you deal psychic damage to 1 or more creatures, creatures, you can replace the number rolled on one of the damage dice, which means that you can do this on AoE spells, which is like your Synaptic Static, for example. If you hit a bunch of creatures with Synaptic Static, you can replace one of the die rolls. If you roll like a 1, you replace that with, your 2d12 from Enkindled Life Force for an average of 13, and now you just increase the damage of that AoE spell by 12. That gets multiplied across all the creatures. It does not specify that only one creature is affected by that. So in those situations, that's actually a very, very powerful effect. Certainly in the right setting, I could see taking this discipline if it's, a setting where I'm expecting to encounter a lot of psychic resistance. So those are all the disciplines. Let's move on to the final section of this video, and that's going to be the Psion spells. So if we first look at the changes to the Psion spell list, there have been a number of new spells added to the game as well as spells added to the Psion spell list. We can see that one spell has been removed. For our first level spells, we have Life Siphon, which is a new spell. In addition to Sanctuary, Shield, and Thunder Wave have been added to the Psion spell list. Level 2 sees Ectoplasmic Trail, Ego Whip, which are both new spells for the Psion, as well as Levitate was added. Level 3, Animate Dead was removed from their spell list, and Bleeding Darkness, a new spell, was added, in addition to Enemies Abound. Level 4 sees Life Inversion Field. This is a new spell as well. Nothing at level 5. Level 6 has Mental Prison, Psionic Blast, and Thought Form, the latter two being new spells. Nothing at level 7, and then level 8 has Abi Dalsim's Horrid Wilting and Anti-Magic Field added to the list, and then nothing at level 9. So those are the changes to the spell list. But now let's take a look at changes to spells. And again, what is included here is spells that only have changes. Again, they did include some of these spells in the original Unearth Arcana. If there are no changes between the original Unearth Arcana and this one, I did not include it in this video. But if these are net new changes to the spell, I'm including them here. So this will include all the new Psion spells as well as spells that have changes or didn't exist in the original Unearth Arcana for the Psion and do exist in this one. Getting started here, we have Abi Dalsim's Horrid Wilting. We can see that this now says constructs automatically succeed at the save, whereas previously they were just unaffected by the spell. Additionally, plant creatures automatically fail the save, whereas before they just rolled at disadvantage for this spell. And then there's another thing that's not here, which is the fact that undead originally were unaffected by the spell, whereas now they can be affected as normal by this spell. So overall, I'm a fan of these changes. I think constructs and undead being unaffected by a number of things has kind of gone on for too long. I think it does make sense in some situations, but it's kind of just an unfun interaction, I guess. Constructs automatically succeeding just means that they're going to take half damage all the time. Plant creatures automatically failing does make this, a lot more predictable against those kinds of creatures whenever you run into them. And for an 8th level spell, I do think that it should have that much more of a punch. This brings us to a new spell called Bleeding Darkness. This one is an action, 60 feet, verbal, somatic, and material components, concentration up to 1 minute. You create an inky void in a 10-foot radius sphere at a point within range. When you cast this spell, magical darkness pours from the sphere, filling a 10-foot radius, 40-foot tall cylinder originating from the sphere until the start of your next turn. It is difficult terrain. No light, magical, or otherwise can illuminate the area. When the darkness appears, each creature must make a con save or take 3d8 cold damage and have the blinded condition until the end of its next turn. The creature also makes a save when it enters the spell's area for the first time or ends its turn there. They can only make the save once per turn. Until the spell ends, you can take a magic action to move the sphere 20 feet horizontally and cause the sphere to pour magical darkness until the start of your next turn. And then you can upcast this for more damage. So just on its own, it sounds kind of cool, but honestly, this just feels like a worse Hunger of Hadar other than the fact that you can move it on subsequent turns. It does seem to be worded in such a way that you wouldn't be able to move the effect of the cylinder across the 20 feet when you move it on subsequent turns like you can with Moonbeam, right? It says you can take the magic action to move the sphere 20 feet horizontally and cause the sphere to pour magical darkness as if it doesn't continue to pour the magical darkness when you move it. So that basically just kind of makes it worse than Moonbeam, although even if it doesn't do that, it does have the additional effects like the difficult terrain and blindness on a fail, which again is separate from the magical darkness itself. So even creatures with Devil Sight or Dark Vision, if they fail that save, they are still just blinded by the effect. So overall, I feel like this sits better at a 2nd level, especially since Hunger of Hadar already exists at 3rd level, and this is on the Warlock spell list. It definitely seems more like Moonbeam. Maybe you just drop the damage by 1d8 and move it down to 2nd level. If I'm picking a 3rd level spell for this effect and I have Hunger of Hadar as a choice, I'm probably just going to choose that. Although that technically is just a choice for the Warlock and no one else. Brings us to the next new spell. This one is called Ectoplasmic Trail. This is a bonus action with a range of self, verbal, somatic components, instantaneous duration. As you cloak yourself in spirits that leave ectoplasm in your wake until the end of your turn. While cloaked, you can move through occupied spaces if they were difficult terrain, and moving doesn't provoke opportunity attacks. If you end your turn in such a space, you are returned to the last unoccupied space you were in. While cloaked, whenever you enter a space of a creature, that creature becomes covered in ectoplasm until the end of your next turn. Creature covered in ectoplasm has its speed reduced by 10 and takes 2d8 necrotic damage at the start of its turn. The creature can be covered in ectoplasm only once during a turn, and upcasting it increases your speed by 10 feet per spell level above 2. This is kind of like an offensive Expeditious Retreat, although you're not getting a speed increase just on the surface of it, at least. Because this is a bonus action, you probably could and maybe should combine this with the dash action, because you're having to go across difficult terrain. It might be very difficult to get enough targets to make it feel like the spell is worth it. That's kind of one critique I have here, is that this only lasts the one round. I mean, technically it lasts until your next turn, so if you can move as a reaction, you can use it again there as well. But the best case scenario without upcasting this, if you have a speed of 30, is that you have 3 enemies in a line, essentially, that you can kind of move into their space and move, and then you get kind of pushed out into the last unoccupied space. And that way you affect 3 creatures, but then you're out of movement. Although you can kind of cheese that to essentially be pushed back to your original space, because it is the last unoccupied space you were in. So if like you're in front of a line of 3 creatures, and you move into each of their spaces at 10 feet each, you end your space in that last creature's space, and then you get pushed back to the space that you were in at the start. So it's kind of like, maybe there's some cheese or some cool strats you could do that way. But as far as just being a damaging spell, it doesn't really feel like it's doing a lot. And I don't know that speed reduction really matters, because you're going to be within range of one or more of them anyway. So even if their speed is reduced by 10 feet, they can probably still get to you on their turn. This reminds me of the 3rd level spell that gives you like extra movement and then deals fire damage to creatures that you pass by, although this one does a little bit more damage and reduces their speed, whereas the 3rd level spell lets you move faster and does less damage. I'm just struggling here because I feel like it should maybe at least increase your speed at the base casting of the spell as well, just to give you just a little bit more to work with, because the Psion doesn't have extra movement on their own, and I don't think 30 feet is enough if moving through an end of the creature's space is still considered difficult terrain. So either have some extra speed at the base casting of the spell, or just remove the difficult terrain and you can just move through creatures as normal. Maybe that would be okay. Probably just increasing your speed by 10 at the base casting of the spell, I think, would probably be enough. That then brings us to the next spell. This one is another new one, or new-ish one. This is Ego Whip. Again, this was a Psionic Discipline before, but this has been changed into a spell. It says it's a casting time of a reaction, which you take when a creature you can see within 30 feet of yourself makes a charisma-based ability check or saving throw. The range is 120 feet, verbal components instantaneous, and the effect is the creature makes a charisma saving throw. Failed save, the target must subtract 1d8 from the ability check or saving throw. They're putting charisma saves on your charisma saves, so you can make charisma saves while you're making charisma saves, which is strange. It's also strange that the range is 120 feet, but it's only triggered on a reaction when a creature you can see within 30 feet of you makes a charisma-based ability check or saving throw, so it's technically only a 30-foot range. Overall, this feels really, really messy, feels really undercooked, and it's like I can't even really judge it seriously, because I just feel like there's so many, it just feels so weird to me. I mean, clearly the range thing is a mistake, only working on charisma-based ability checks or saving throws, and then causing a charisma-based saving throw at the same time. Like, it just, there's too much repetition. It feels like this is trying to be a more balanced version of Silvery Barbs, because people often say that Silvery Barbs should be a 2nd level spell to help balance it. Honestly, this is just so much worse than Silvery Barbs would be even at 2nd level. Not saying that we need another Silvery Barbs, but I really think they just need to go back to the drawing board on this one. So let's go ahead and move on from Ego Whip. Let's look at the next spell, Enemies Abound. This one is effectively the same. It is basically just a big formatting update. It just looks a lot cleaner, but all the effects are exactly the same. Moving on then to another new spell. This one is called Life Inversion Field. It is an action to cast, range of self, verbal somatic components, concentration up to 1 minute. An aura radiates from you in a 30-foot emanation for the duration. When you create the aura, you regain 4d8 hit points. Whenever you regain hit points, you can choose a creature within the aura and force it to make a con save. On a failed save, they take necrotic damage equal to half the amount of hit points you regained, rounded up. They can make the save only once per turn. And then when you cast it at a higher level, you increase the healing by 1d8. If you have an aura, you regain hit points the turn that you cast it, and then when you regain hit points at any point during that duration of the spell, you can target a creature within the aura, make them make a con save. They take damage equal to half the healing you received. I will say, without a built-in way to regain hit points on each of your turns at least, this feels a little underwhelming for a 4th level spell. I do think that there are possibly interesting combinations, because we rarely have a way to turn healing into damage. Like if you're basically at almost 1 health and there's another player effect that can restore you to full health, and depending on how many hit points you have, that could be a lot of burst damage in that specific situation. But because there is no damage on a successful save, I think the incentive of dumping healing resources into the person with the field feels like it's very, very high risk. Basically, this spell is only as good as whatever healing comes after it. If no one heals you after the fact, then this is not going to do anything. And this feels like a spell that you're only going to be casting when you're at low hit points, because then you know that people who can heal you are probably going to be dumping those spells into you, and then you know that those are going to be triggered more often. Whereas if you use this more proactively when you're at higher health, then maybe they're not as motivated to throw healing spells at you when they could do something more effective with their turn. So for a 4th level spell, I mean, I think there's a lot of potential, but it just feels like it's lacking at least a small amount of regular healing on your turn. Like, you know, if nothing else, if there's no healing from anywhere else, I feel like this needs to be self-sustaining, at least like 1d8 you regain 1d8 hit points on each of your turns. Technically, you could combine this with things like the durable feat, which allows you to regain hit points using a hit die as a bonus action on your turn. But I just really don't feel like spells should have to function on external action to make them useful. So that then brings us to the next spell called Life Siphon. Level 1 spell, action 120 feet, somatic components and instantaneous. You fire an orb of psionic energy fueled by your life force at a creature within range. A ranged spell attack on hit deals 1d10 psychic damage, and you can expend 1 hit point die to increase the damage by 1d10. When you upcast this, the base damage increases by 1d10 as well as the number of hit dice you can expend for each spell level above 1. I will say I just feel like this is worse than every other ranged spell attack at this level. That would be like Chromatic Orb and Chaos Bolt, I think is the other one. I don't know if they're Guiding Bolt is another one at level 1. This one technically scales very well if you upcast it because it's effectively increasing by 2d10 every level, which is a lot. But at the base level of level 1, it feels pretty weak. But at least at the base level of level 1, it feels pretty weak. The only real benefit that it has is that it's psychic damage, which is technically a more reliable damage type, but so is Radiant on Guiding Bolt. And even Chromatic Orb, you can choose the damage type, so if you know which one to use, you can avoid resistance that way. Again, I can see where the scaling could be a big deal in the right situation, but overall, I'm not really seeing the draw of this one, at least at base level. So moving on, we're going to look at an existing spell called Mental Prison. This is a 6th level illusion spell. We can see here that the initial damage has increased to 8d10 from 5d10. The damage on a successful saving throw has been reduced to just half that 8d10, whereas previously it was a full 5d10. And then lastly, the secondary damage at the bottom there highlighted, you can see was reduced to 5d10, and this was originally 10d10. So the total damage on a failed save has been reduced by up to 2d10, but the damage is now front loaded, so when they fail the initial saving throw, they take a full 8d10 damage, which means that you're relying less on triggering that secondary half of the damage to do most of the damage of the spell. So I like that shifting of the balance. Maybe that's worth the loss of 2d10 to make sure that you always have the most of the damage up front. And then the total damage on a successful save has been reduced by effectively 1d10 by having the 4d10 instead of having 5d10 on a fail. And, in a very kind of popular combination with the old Mental Prison and the old class design as well was for the Fiend Warlock at level 14 or higher, they had the Hurl Through Hell. And then Mental Prison, they could get through their Warlock feature that lets them get spells of 6th level or higher. Can't remember what the name of it is off the top of my head, but you would basically trap them in a Mental Prison and then Hurl Through Hell, which technically moves them out of that space, causing the trigger of the second damage as well as doing all the damage from Hurl Through Hell. And you do like 30 or 40 d10 damage in one round. So combined with the nerfs to Hurl Through Hell as well as the nerfs to Mental Prison here, that combo still technically exists. It's just much, much less exciting. Again, I'm not really mad at any of these changes. I do like the front-loaded nature of it, but these are technically nerfs. So now we're going to look at another new spell. This one is called Psionic Blast. Level 6 evocation, actions, range of self, components are verbal, somatic, and material. Duration is instantaneous. It says you release a concussive burst of psionic energy. Each creature in a 60-foot cone originating from you makes an intelligence saving throw. On a failed save, the creature takes 68 psychic damage and has the stunned condition until the start of your next turn. On a successful save, they take half as much damage only. Damage increases by 1d8 per spell level above 6. So this is basically the Mind Flayer Mind Blast Psionic Blast. So you can now use that as a player, meaning that you are either a Scion or a Wizard. Very cool. I'm kind of excited to see this one here. When I saw Psionic Blast mentioned in the changed spells, this is kind of exactly what I was hoping it would be. So again, I'm very excited that this one is here. So that then brings us to an existing spell. This is Psychic Scream. This one is actually in the original Unearth Arcana. One thing I didn't notice is that the Wizard no longer would have access to this spell. It says that it's only the Bard, Scion, Sorcerer, and Warlock. It's currently on the Wizard spell list, but if they release this as is, that means it's removed from the Wizard spell list. So maybe they thought, having the 6th level Mind Blast, Psionic Blast is good enough. They don't need Psychic Scream, but that was a change that I thought was a little interesting. Moving on to another existing spell, we see Tasha's Mind Whip. The only change here from the original Unearth Arcana is that the choice of an affected creature to choose whether they get to move, take an action, or a bonus action, movement has been added back to the spell. In the original Unearth Arcana, they removed movement, and so they just had to choose between taking an action or a bonus action. I thought that was basically inconsequential. The choice between movement or an action or movement and a bonus action can be much more detrimental to that creature, whereas choosing between an action or a bonus action, I'm always going to choose my action, of course. So I'm definitely happy to see this one back. That then brings us to the Scion Cantrip. We saw this one originally in the Unearthed Arcana before. This is Telekinetic Fleeing. The changes here is that the components are now just somatic. And the effect now says choose one non-magical object weighing 1 to 5 pounds within 10 feet of you that isn't being worn or carried. Breathe it in psionic energy, fling it. Range spell attack, 1d10 damage on a hit. And then it says on a hit or miss, the object falls to the ground undamaged. The changes here is that this is now only somatic, whereas previously this was verbal and material. It still technically requires some kind of physical object to fling, whereas previously this required any type of ammunition like arrows, crossbow bolts, bullets, stones for the sling or whatever. Notably, the flung object is no longer destroyed, whereas it was always destroyed in the previous version. While I think this is a step up from what we saw before, I do feel like the requirement of a non-magical object weighing 1 to 5 pounds within 10 feet of you still feels like a lot of requirements for a cantrip. It's like I get the flavor that they're going for, but I feel like flavor is kind of getting in the way of mechanics in this situation. And that then brings us to the final of the spells in this Unearth Arcana for the Psion, and that is a new spell called Thought Form. This is a bonus action to cast with a range of self, verbal, and material components. The material component is brain matter in a vessel worth 500 gold or more, so that is a costly component. Duration is concentration up to 1 minute. As you briefly transform into a psionic spirit, you gain the following benefits until the spell ends. You have immunity to poison and psychic damage, and you have immunity to the exhaustion condition. In corporeal movement, you have a fly speed of 60 feet and can hover. You can move through occupied spaces if they are difficult terrain. If you end your turn in such a space, you take 1d10 force damage, and you are expelled to the last unoccupied space you were in. Finally, you have psionic recharge. As a magic action, you can touch a creature, which can be yourself, and roll 1d6. The creature regains 1 expended spell slot, of the level of which is half the number rolled, rounded up or lower. Once a creature regains a spell slot from the spell, the creature can't do so again until it finishes a long rest. So one thing I do when I look at new spells is I try to look at other spells at the same level. This seems kind of very similar to like the investiture spells from the Elemental Evil campaign. This is like your investiture of fire, investiture of wind. Those are an action to cast and they last 10 minutes, but looking at the effects of this spell compared to the effects of those spells, I don't see any reason that this one shouldn't also last 10 minutes. I would think it's pretty unlikely that the ghostly form and incorporeal movement are both useful at the same time in most encounters, whereas the effects of the investiture spell are probably more of them are more useful at any given time. Beyond that, the final feature, the psionic recharge, I think is a big draw of this spell. That's probably one of the more powerful things that the spell is doing for you, because you are not limited to using it only once. You can use it once per creature. So if you have a very spellcaster heavy party, you need the time and opportunity to go up to each of them and restore one of their spell slots. And if you only have a minute to do that, and especially if like it's after combat, you're like, okay, an action is 6 seconds kind of. How quickly can I get around? How many spell slots can I restore? So I just think having a slightly longer duration would make this perfectly fine. Like 10 minutes I think is okay. Maybe they drop immunity to resistance to psychic and poison damage and then immunity to exhaustion to balance the fact that it's 10 minutes instead of 1. I just feel like this needs to last longer just because you need the time and opportunity to help your allies as well. Overall, I think it's a fun spell. I don't know that's necessarily super powerful, but that psionic recharge is really exciting, especially for like your rangers and classes that are like half casters or quarter casters, whatever they are, simply because those smaller spell slots that you're getting from the psionic recharge mean a lot more to them than they would like a wizard or a sorcerer. So that then brings us to the final question of this video, and that is the revised Psion any good? And I think it was mostly okay originally, and now it's just been buffed and streamlined basically across the board. There may be some balance considerations with things like Enkindled Life Force and the way that interacts with the different psionic disciplines and other psionic dice effects. But at the same time, that is their capstone, and what is balance at level 20 anyway? It's very difficult to kind of consider what that is. I don't really think that there are any problems in the class design currently with Enkindled Life Force. At level 20, you're probably fighting, legendary monsters of CR 25 or higher, and they have just insane stats. So, the small bonuses that you're getting from Enkindled Life Force kind of necessary to even compete at that level, but it is something maybe keep in mind. As far as spells go, I think some of the new spells like Bleeding Darkness, Ectoplasmic Trail, Life Siphon, and Thought Form maybe need a little bit of tuning. Ego Whip, I just think needs another look entirely. That one felt pretty rushed and like maybe didn't get the care that it needed to make sense. Life Inversion Field, the one that lets you turn healing into damage and aura around you, feels a little underwhelming without its own source of repeatable healing. It's kind of similar to Beacon of Hope, where it's only as good as whatever happens after the spell is cast, but at least Beacon of Hope has other effects that are constantly happening. I think it's advantage on like wisdom saving throws or something like that. Whereas Life Inversion Field after the first turn does nothing if you don't get healed. So either having some repeatable source of healing, having some secondary effect that happens all the time, or even turning the healing into an area of effect where you can affect any number of creatures within the aura each time you get healed. That might be something to consider as well. Maybe you'd buff it up, to a 5th level spell instead of 4th level, but something along those lines. I just feel like it needs that one little thing more to make it feel good to cast. Lastly, Telekinetic Fling, I think, again, I just don't feel like it needs to rely on a material component of any kind. Technically, it's just somatic, but you still need that object within range. Again, I just think that they're overcomplicating a cantrip. They're called Mind Bullets for a reason, Kyle. If you want a cantrip that requires some form of ammunition, that's what we have Magic Stone for. But those are just my opinions. I would love to know what you all think about the revised Psion down in the comments below. Again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.